You're listening to the Untold American Podcast, hosted by Dean and Jess. It's your go-to show for uncovering the fascinating, bizarre, and untold stories of American history and news. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of the stories you won't hear anywhere else.
Welcome back to Untold American, where we uncover the hidden and often unsettling truths lurking beneath the surface of American history. I'm Dean, and with me as always is...
Yes.
Today we're diving into a story that's both strange and unsettling. Imagine your city suddenly enveloped in a thick, mysterious fog, only to discover it's not a natural phenomenon, but part of a secret military experiment.
It sounds like something out of a sci-fi thriller, but it actually happened, Dean.
It did. It happened in San Francisco in 1950, and it was called Operation Sea Spray.
And this isn't just some dusty history lesson. What makes Operation Sea Spray so fascinating is that it has some really eerie parallels to some strange events happening right now in 2025.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Take us back to 1950. What was happening?
Well, the Cold War was in full swing. The fear of communism was palpable, and the threat of biological warfare was looming large after the devastation of World War II. The idea that a microscopic enemy could cripple entire cities or even nations was terrifyingly real.
So naturally, the U.S. military was desperate to understand how vulnerable American cities were to a biological attack. Enter Operation Sea Spray. And they decided to use San Francisco as their testing ground. A bustling city with over 800,000 residents.
They did. What's fascinating here is that they turned an entire city into a giant petri dish without anyone knowing, of course. For 6 days in September 1950, the U.S. Navy released 2 types of bacteria from a ship just off the coast, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii.
They released bacteria over a city of 800,000 people. They weren't worried about the consequences?
At the time, the prevailing scientific understanding was that these bacteria were harmless.
Harmless. So what happened? Did they just spray it and hope for the best?
Not exactly. They sprayed this bacterial cocktail using industrial hoses, and based on their monitoring equipment, they estimated that pretty much every single resident of San Francisco inhaled thousands of these bacterial particles. To put that into perspective, Dean, the amount they released was actually within the range of infectivity for anthrax.
Okay, so maybe not so harmless after all.
Right. And as we'll see, our understanding of these microorganisms has evolved considerably since then. For example, 11 people were hospitalized at Stanford University Hospital with very rare and serious urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens.
So people did get sick? And what about long-term effects?
It's hard to say for sure. One of those hospitalized, a man named Edward J. Nevin, who'd recently had prostate surgery, died from a heart valve infection linked to the bacteria.
This is crazy, and they just kept it all under wraps. Nobody knew.
The public was kept completely in the dark about this experiment for decades. The government's involvement wasn't revealed until Senate subcommittee hearings in 1977.
Can you imagine finding out that you and your loved ones were unknowingly exposed to a potentially dangerous bacteria as part of a secret government experiment? It's incredible.
It is. It's a breach of trust on a monumental scale. And you know what else is fascinating? This wasn't an isolated incident.
What do you mean?
Between 1949 and 1969, the Army conducted 239 open-air tests of biological agents. They were essentially using American citizens as guinea pigs in their quest to understand biological warfare.
239 tests. That's insane. Where were these tests conducted? Not all in San Francisco, I imagine.
No, they were conducted in other cities across the country, including Florida, Minnesota, New York City, Washington, D.C., even the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Hold on. They released bacteria on the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Yes, and in 1966, they even released bacteria in the New York City subway system. They concluded that a similar attack with a pathogenic agent could expose vast numbers of people to infection.
It really does feel like an episode of The Twilight Zone, except this actually happened. So what does all this have to do with those reports of strange chemical-scented fog we saw in California, Florida, and Kansas in early 2025?
That's where those eerie parallels come in, Dean. Remember, this fog appeared during the holiday season when travel is at its peak. People reported respiratory problems, eye irritation. It looks strange, too, kind of like swirling white particles in the air.
I remember seeing those reports. It was pretty freaky. And I know some people were worried about the government being involved somehow, given their history with these types of experiments.
Exactly. And while there are scientific explanations for the fog, such as advection fog or radiation fog, the government's past actions make it hard for some people to dismiss the possibility of something more mysterious.
Especially given the lack of transparency surrounding those past experiments.
Right. It's like the government has eroded the public's trust to the point where any unusual environmental phenomenon is met with suspicion.
So we have a mysterious fog, a history of secret government experiments, and a public that's understandably wary, where do we go from here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. How much do we really know about what's happening? And can we trust the government to be transparent with us?
This is a lot to think about, but I'm glad we're talking about it. These are important questions.
They are. It's crucial that we learn from the past, even if those lessons are unsettling, especially when they might be repeating themselves right before our eyes. You know, Dean, as we were talking before, something occurred to me that think about the people who were living in San Francisco back in 1950. Imagine going about your day completely oblivious to the fact that you were being exposed to bacteria as part of a military experiment.
Right. It's talking about a violation of trust, and the fact that it remained a secret for so long just adds to that sense of betrayal.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what else? Don't we know what other secret experiments have been conducted on unsuspecting citizens throughout history?
Well, we do know that Operation Sea Spray wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of government secrecy and experimentation during the Cold War.
That's true. Back then, the fear of communism and the threat of nuclear war fueled government secrecy and paranoia, which is really interesting when you compare it to today's world.
It's almost like history is repeating itself. The war on terror, the rise of surveillance technologies, and a renewed focus on biosecurity all contribute to that same sense of unease.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And just like during the Cold War, there's a sense that the government is willing to go to great lengths in the name of national security, even if it means compromising individual liberties.
And that brings us back to that mysterious fog of 2025. Whether it's a natural phenomenon or something more nefarious, it's tapping into those deep-seated anxieties about government overreach and the potential for hidden agendas.
Think about it, Dean, that fog has become a kind of Rorschach test for people's beliefs about the government. Some see it as a harmless weather event, while others view it as evidence of a sinister plot.
It's true. We're all projecting our own fears and suspicions onto this fog, especially since the government has done such a poor job of addressing those concerns.
There's a real lack of transparency, which just fuels speculation and distrust, and that erosion of trust can have real-world consequences.
Think about the way social media blew up. When the fog was first reported, all those wild theories and unverified claims spreading like wildfire. It's a reminder of how quickly misinformation can spread, especially when there's a vacuum of credible information.
Right. That's why it's so important to be critical of the information we're consuming, to question our sources, and to demand transparency from those in power.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
How do we rebuild trust and ensure that something like Operation Sea Spray never happens again?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It requires open government accountability and meaningful public engagement. We need to demand more transparency from our elected officials and hold them accountable for their actions.
We need to be active participants in the democratic process, not just passive recipients of government dictates.
Exactly true. National security depends on more than just military might. It depends on the trust and well-being of the people.
It's about finding that balance between protecting our freedoms and ensuring our safety, a balance that's often elusive but always worth striving for.
You know, Dean, I really do believe that this conversation we're having is a part of that shift. By shining a light on these dark chapters of history, we can help ensure that they're not repeated in the future. As the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
But remembering the past isn't enough. We also need to learn from it to adapt our thinking and find new ways to safeguard our freedoms in a world that's constantly changing.
That's what's so fascinating about all of this, Dean. Sometimes those lessons come from the most unexpected places. Even a mysterious fog can remind us of the importance of vigilance, critical thinking, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
It's incredible to think about how far we've come since that first bacteria-laced fog settled over San Francisco, and yet here we are all these years later facing similar questions about government transparency and accountability.
The mysteries surrounding Operation Sea Spray and the recent fog may never be fully solved, but the questions they raise are more relevant than ever.
And that's what Untold American is all about. It's about digging beneath the surface, uncovering the hidden stories, and exploring the complexities of American history.
It's about sparking curiosity, encouraging critical thinking, and empowering listeners to become more informed and engaged citizens.
Because ultimately, the story of America is not just about what happened in the past, it's about what we choose to do with that knowledge in the present.
It's about shaping a future where transparency, accountability, and the well-being of all citizens are paramount.
Well said. Now, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today.
But don't worry, we'll be back next week with another intriguing story from the annals of American history. As always, I'm Jess.
And I'm Dean. Until next time, Welcome back to Untold American.
where we delve into the hidden corners of history and explore the mysteries that continue to shape our world.
I'm Dean, and I'm joined as always by
Jess?
Jess. We've been discussing Operation Sea Spray and these other unsettling experiments.
It's incredible to think that the U.S. government would release bacteria over its own citizens.
It really is. And it raises so many questions about government transparency, accountability, and the ethics of scientific experimentation.
You know, one thing that strikes me about this whole story is the power of fear and uncertainty. During the Cold War, the fear of communism and biological warfare was so pervasive that it created an environment where these kinds of experiments were deemed acceptable.
That's a great point. People were willing to sacrifice individual liberties in the name of national security. And it's interesting how we're seeing some of those same dynamics at play today.
Exactly. With the war on terror and the rise of new and unknown threats, it's easy to see how fear can be used to justify actions that might otherwise be considered unacceptable.
And when you combine that fear with a lack of transparency from the government, it creates a breeding ground for suspicion and conspiracy theories.
Right. Look at the fog of 2025. It's like a blank canvas onto which people are projecting their own anxieties and beliefs.
Some people see it as a harmless natural phenomena, while others are convinced it's evidence of something more sinister. And without clear and consistent communication from the authorities, who can blame them for being suspicious?
It all boils down to trust, Dean. Once that trust is broken, it can be very difficult to rebuild.
So what can we do about it? How do we ensure that something like Operation Sea Spray never happens again?
Well, I think it starts with demanding accountability from our leaders. We need to hold them to a higher standard of transparency and ethical conduct.
We also need to be more critical consumers of information. We can't just blindly accept everything we read or hear, especially when it comes to emotionally charged issues.
Absolutely. It's about engaging in thoughtful dialogue, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our freedoms and ensuring that our government acts in the best interests of the people.
Dean, one of the most important lessons we can learn from Operation Sea Spray is that the pursuit of knowledge and scientific advancement should never come at the expense of human life or dignity.
I think that's a great takeaway. No matter how important the goal, the ends don't justify the means. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we move forward into an increasingly complex and uncertain future.
We need to approach scientific exploration and technological innovation with humility and responsibility, recognizing that our actions can have unintended and far-reaching consequences.
We also need to be mindful of the potential for these advancements to be used for harmful purposes and work to establish safeguards to prevent that from happening.
It's a delicate balance, but one that we must strive to achieve if we want to create a world where everyone can thrive.
This has been an eye-opening conversation, Jess. Thank you for shedding light on this dark chapter of American history.
It's been my pleasure, Dean. As always, I'm Jess.
And I'm Dean. Tune in next time for more Untold American.
This has been the Untold American podcast with Dean and Jess. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed exploring these untold stories with us. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with fellow history buffs and curious minds. Don't forget to leave a review. Your support helps us uncover even more fascinating stories. Until next time, stay curious and keep discovering America's untold tales.